Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lori Grace. I just want to say that I'm very happy that you're here, and I have been meeting together with two supervisors in Marin Parks and Rec. We also had a wonderful meeting at Judy's house of select activists, and in addressing this issue of glyphosate use in Marin. So I wanted to let you know that in meeting with the Marin Parks Department and with the Kate Sears and Katie Rice, I think everybody is well-intentioned. They would like to reduce chemicals in Marin. They would like to have us be a leader again, as we were with Marin Clean Energy and other kinds of things. And they felt a little bit singled out about their use. Marin Parks and Rec Department, and I actually promised to speak their point of view for a moment, feel they use 0.25% of glyphosate use in the county. Now, both the supervisors, Kate Sears and Katie Rice, and the Marin Parks Department would like to see the creation of an education program for the general public around using Roundup in your backyards, which sounds great to me. And I've offered to help with that. So the dialogue will continue. And with the WHO report coming out showing the carcinogens, I think that that something is going to come and be underway. And as I really use empathizing with people to create a connection, and I did with Marin Parks and Rec and with also the supervisors, and it's change is slow, but I would like to see it eliminated. I do want to let you know that the Marin Master Gardeners would not receive a copy of the glyphosate bibliography, the 9-page bibliography of articles and news articles that I had produced in October. They did not want to see it at UC Davis because Marin Master Gardeners recommends Roundup. Okay? Other places that recommend Roundup here in Marin, which you probably already know if you went to that supervisors meeting, are the Friends of Corte Madera Creek, Marin Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, Marin Conservation League, and the Native Plant Society. Okay, so there's a lot of different opinions, but I'm hoping that with some quality education over time, possibly some campaigns, political campaigns, and other things, we can make a change. And we can affect something like we did at Marin Water District. I think that they've done something very brave. They've really taken a step in a new direction, and the Parks Department is watching. Okay? So with that, I'd like to say thank you and how grateful I am for you all to be here. Vallianatos, Dr. Vallianatos is going to talk first to set a context for what happened at the EPA when glyphosate went forward, and this is to balance some of the marketing. If you look up Don Huber's name on Google, you will find that Monsanto has placed a lot of negative marketing material about him. So now Dr. Vallianatos will show up what is Monsanto really like. And okay.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Lori Grace for this invitation, and I'm very, very delighted to be with you. To start the history, I will say a few things about myself so you can understand and put it in a historical context. By the time I joined EPA in 1979, I already had a BA in zoology and a doctor's degree in history, and I had done postdoctoral studies in the history of science. And I had already published my first book about the transfer of science and technology from the United States to countries like Colombia, India. I was trying to figure out all these claims of the so-called Green Revolution. Those of you who remember the 70s and 80s, in fact, they used the terminology to this very day, that by Green Revolution they mean the industrialized version of agriculture, because they kept saying, and they still keep saying, that we need to feed the world. And so with that kind of, I would say, propaganda, they pushed on pesticides and big machinery and fewer crops, and we are in the predicament that we face today. So when I went from my postdoctoral studies at Harvard to Washington, I worked for 2 years on Capitol Hill. And so when I went on Capitol Hill, I joined the so-called Office of Technology Assessment, which was a joint committee. And we were doing projects for senators, for congressmen that requested them, all about food and agriculture. Those 2 years were really very critical because that's how I discovered Washington. And I was not very pleased by the discoveries I made during those 2 years period, because everything the government and the industry was doing was really to benefit the people who already had large farms or money. They were not very concerned about small-scale farmers. Remember, in the United States, we have had the family farmer, and the legislation down to mid-20th century was that all support ought to go to those who had 160 acres or less. And in the West, since we live in California, that had profound implications because of the water. Federal government spent billions of dollars with canals and rivers and all the water in order to go to water small-scale farms. But a massive corruption ensued, that the Department of the Interior never enforced the law. And eventually in 1980s, I remember with Senator Church, they raised the minimum from 160 acres to 2,000 acres. So this is what's going on in California. And so when I joined EPA in 1979, I had a vague idea how the government worked and what was supposed to do. And I joined the program that is, to this very day, is called Office of Pesticide Programs. What you can say, why the government has so many people working for pesticides? I mean, this is the largest EPA program. When I was there in 1979, we had 800 people, most of them toxicologists, chemists, biologists, ecologists, you name it. It was perfect. And I felt like at the university. I mean, all this research going on and projects, all to supposedly help us from being exposed to these chemicals. And in particular, I spent a couple of years working for a small program that we'll call it Farm Worker Protection Program. And as part of that, they sent me to North Carolina and a couple of other places where I took intensive kind of seminars about what happens to people, human beings, farm workers, in a kind of a vineyard, let's say, or any other orchard where they kept spraying this stuff. And I learned a lot of stuff. I mean, people were talking about exposure by eating the fruit that you harvest, on your skin, breathing the air. And most of the farm workers I discovered didn't even speak English. So the instructions of the labor were meaningless. And when I got back, I wrote a number of memoranda. A memorandum, by the way, is the only way you communicate. Now they have the email, of course. You communicate with your supervisors, saying observations, and so on and so on. And I knew that the situation was pretty critical, so I was very careful in what I said, and I footnoted everything, just like in my book. All sorts of footnotes, giving the factual evidence, who said what, when, and so on. So they could not criticize me for anything. And I told my supervisor, this is unacceptable, because I discovered in that process of learning that they were using neurotoxins in a vineyard where human beings go to harvest your crop. Neurotoxins, by the way, are related to chemical warfare stuff. World War I, remember they used chlorine to kill each other by the millions in Europe. World War II came, and the Germans and the Allies all had piles of neurotoxins of tremendous potential. But of course, they never fought a chemical warfare. So World War II came to an end, and they passed all these weapons to farmers, because the farmers had by that time become industrialized, and agriculture changed fundamentally. So the pesticides question came to be critical to the survival of large farmers, because they could not hire, say, hundreds of farm workers to do weeding and all sorts of other things. So rather they put the stuff in a helicopter and spray, and they didn't pay very much attention about human effects, much less ecological effects. But then we have in 1962 a nice lady by the name of Rachel Carson. She wrote a wonderful book called Silent Spring in '62, and she said to those who read it that, we are abusing everything. Agriculture is not just one crop production; it's a variety of crops, and it takes a healthy ecosystem to produce something good, and not to kill birds and other very important animals, including us that we eat the food. And I remember President Kennedy was president then in 1963. He got excited. He invited Rachel Carson to the White House, and a couple of senators, they had hearings about the questions she raised, and she was interviewing CBS and so on. But then the chemical industry had begun to attack her ferociously. So they called her a spinster, they called her a communist, because she had marshaled all the evidence from the published literature to produce this book, which is very good to this very day. So I read the book. The moment I got to EPA, I read the book. I read Rachel Carson's book. And then I began to face problems within the EPA because of the memoranda I wrote about farm workers and so on. And then I discovered all sorts of other things, and I'll tell you now a story that goes to the core of what I'm trying to say. In the 50s, starting in the 50s, a professor from Northwestern University built a huge laboratory outside of Chicago. He called that laboratory Industrial Biotest Laboratory. And soon enough, that laboratory became the largest laboratory in the country in terms of testing pesticides, drugs, all sorts of other chemicals. And they were testing this for state governments, for private individuals, for companies, of course, including the federal government. And these gentlemen and ladies, I don't know whether the women in that laboratory in the 50s and 60s, but they began a systematic way of making up numbers, fraudulent stuff, in order to produce a report that said, hey, look, FDA, this drug is perfectly all right for you. There will be no problems. Hey, EPA, this chemical that is being proposed, no unreasonable adverse effects on man and the environment. According to the law, that's what you have to have in order to get something approved. But then a very ingenious pathologist from the Federal Drug Administration named Adrian Gross, he did an inspection. And he discovered all this fraud. So the moment the federal government discovered that the largest laboratory in the country, which was testing 40% of all chemicals in this country were tested by that one laboratory. They said, now what can we do? So they said, as far to continue the process and not to pursue the likes of Monsanto and DuPont and so on, they said, well, we have complementary studies, so don't worry about it. And then, meanwhile, they ordered the companies to repeat their tests. And by the way, for those of you who don't know what's going on, those tests can take 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. Meanwhile, their product is still in the market, and they're used, and so on and so on. And so EPA was caught in this kind of tragedy, and they shut down the laboratory, of course. But it took it down to 1983 with Reagan being a president. Remember Reagan? In 1983, they shut down the laboratory, despite the fact that the federal judge, tried to say, we have no evidence to do this, but they did it. The other fellow judges warned him that if he actually dismissed the trial, he would be out of a job. So he went ahead with that, and they finally shut down the laboratory. And then EPA began to discover smaller-scale laboratories all over the country, including California. And they began to shut the laboratories down. But then they discovered, of course, that each time they did something like this, there were repercussions, because the owners of the laboratories would go to their congressman or senator, and they, in turn, would pick up the phone and call up the administrator. And, of course, the budget time came, and they would say, OK, you're going to do that. Guess what? You're going to get minus X millions of dollars. So with that kind of reality, EPA did something unprecedented. They said, now, since we cannot really pursue these crooks, the best way to do it is to avoid looking at the crooks. So they outsource their own responsibility of evaluating the data coming from the chemical industry. They hire companies. To this very day, they take the data from the industry, they look at the data, then they send a report to EPA, and EPA, in the basis of that report alone, says, okay, this chemical looks okay, go ahead and use it. So this is the story, and the man who discovered Adrian Gross, he had his office next to mine, so from 79 down to 19, for another 10 years, he and I had a perpetual discussion. He gave me everything he ever written. And then the EPA brought him in. They hired this guy, and they made him a branch chief of toxicology. Toxicology is something that you look at slides to find out if there's what kind of problem, especially cancer. And Adrian was telling me that it took him 15 years to begin to identify the different forms of cancer on the slides. And he discovered in his own laboratory, in his own branch that was made of about 100 toxicologists, they were perpetuating their own form of fraud. How? The chemical industry does a study, and that means they will send you 5,000 pages of data, raw data from the laboratory, each animal, and all these other things. So these gentlemen and ladies in the toxicology branch, instead of spending the time and the days and the months to go carefully over the data, they would go straight to the conclusion, about a couple of pages. They would cut it and paste in it and make it in their own conclusion. So the whole process was called cut and paste science. This is in 1979, 81, 82. Reagan was in power. And of course, for the Reagan administration to admit it, it was a disaster. So they hired a company, a consultant, who promptly discovered there was no problem. But meanwhile, what do you think they did to the Adrian Gross? They couldn't fire him, of course, because he had Senator Kennedy and a couple of other senators that supported him. So they gave him a room and a computer, and he did nothing for the next 10 years, and he died in 1992. So this is the political context then of the tragedy evolving. And the other story I want to tell you is something that relates to honeybees. Before I proceed on the honeybee story, I wrote this book. And I urge all of you to read it, not because I'm going to make a lot of money, but because this book is the only book in existence that gives you a very detailed account, a history, as I saw it from within, for starting in the early 60s down to mid-90s. Because after that, it became very difficult to get information. And what happened? What did I do? This is written on basis 100% of government documents. How did I do it? My own colleagues would come, we would have lunch. And when you have lunch with a colleague, you talk about what you do. Oh, yeah, I'm dealing with this question about honeybees or other things. And do you know that this happened in Idaho, and I have the evidence? And then they would bring me 2, 3, 4, 5 memoranda that describe in detail what happened, their evidence, the pictures and everything. And on the basis of that, I said to myself, since for 20 years or more, I could not really be effective because they would never listen to me. I was too low in the hierarchy. And besides that, they say, you are not a team player, because I was raising all these questions. And a bureaucracy, just like a corporation, when you set up the policy on the very top, the people below, So the scientists kept doing good science, but then the decision was done by the political appointees. Okay, so I urge you to read it, and not only that, but I urge you to buy more than a copy and give it to your friends. Okay, that's enough about the book. The honey bee question is the following. In 1976, EPA, first of all, came into existence in December 1970 by guess who? President Nixon, a Republican. He appointed a Republican administrator, Rockhouse, and they had the courage to ban DDT in 1972, less than 2 years when the EPA came into being. That, just like the case of Rachel Carson, caused the same storm. In other words, the industry began to call EPA that is beyond EPA's to do this, and we have to teach them a lesson. And they threatened EPA's existence and so on. But for reasons of the time, the Rocket House stood by, and the EPA, DDT was banned, and we are much better for it. And of course, EPA banned DDT not only because it was causing horrendous problems to the survival of birds, but because DDT was also a potential human carcinogen. The same sort of reaction now you have about glyphosate coming out of the World Health Organization, the same thing. So the honeybee question, in 1976, by that time EPA was less than 6 years old, had approved the use of neurotoxins, and they put the neurotoxins in nylon microcapsules, the diameter of which was about 50 microns. That is the size of specks of dust. So the honeybee would go, and then she would actually die on the spot, or she would bring the stuff to her hive, and the whole hive would die. And now 30 years later, now we have a new version of the same chemicals that they're known as neonicotinoids, and they have been devastating. So, I can elaborate further, but the point is that these stories I told you, these two little stories, one about the laboratories and the other about honeybees, tell me, at least, and I hope it tells you, that the system is beyond control. Literally speaking, the chemical industry has captured the government, and in this case, EPA. Just like the pharmaceutical has captured the FDA, and the big agribusiness has captured USDA, and so on and so on. And I find that preposterous and undemocratic, because in a democracy, you need to have people that will actually represent you. And the people we have now that pretend that they represent you, they don't. Because I saw it and I documented it distinctly here, the decision comes directly from the people that the president appointed. In other words, the scientist can be as good as a Nobel Prize winner. He can write the best scientific treatise about the hazards of this, and you should not do this, and let's postpone, and let's have a moratorium. But nevertheless, the decision is being done by the political appointees. So in any case that we have to do something about it, we have to rethink about the whole organization of the Environmental Protection Agency, to rethink it in a different way. That is, that it has to be an independent agency, and maybe the president ought to appoint, or at least to nominate a person, a man and woman, to say serve for 10 years, but he should not have the right to appoint the deputies of the administrator, so that the administrator has his own men or women, so they will be dependent of congressional pressure and the White House. I know it sounds almost beyond the reach, but unless we do that, we are trapped in this scenario I already cited. And the political...
Question's okay, or would you like to continue?
Yeah, go ahead, ask the question.
Okay. Have you seen a kind of a variation between the Republican and Democratic administration?
Regrettably, no. I think both of them, both parties, when it comes to environmental problems, they are literally speaking biased in the same extent. And indeed, I can, the only difference with me, when Jimmy Carter was the president, the man smiled a lot, and he was very polite, and the bureaucrats were given money, and they were assured they would be dependent and so on. But behind our backs, all these negotiations about the laboratories I mentioned. Remember, the laboratory, the big fraud laboratory, was discovered in 1976, the first year of Jimmy Carter's administration. I remember distinctly in the summer of 1980, I was at a meeting where we were notified that the White House had decided that EPA was going to pursue only the laboratory. Forget about the fact that Monsanto, for instance, had its own man in the laboratory faking data. They said, forget about that. So just focus on the laboratory. So the orders come from the White House, and they come from Congress. Congress, when they are disappointed with you, they call the White House and vice versa, and then you get a letter, or your supervisor or the director of the division speaks to you and say, hey, we need to process that petition. We need to satisfy that and go ahead and do that. And this is how it's happening. So that's why I'm suggesting that on any kind of a vision for a new organization, the political dimension has to be restricted or completely eliminated. So we need to create something like a Supreme Court or like the Federal Reserve. And I'm speaking of those institutions because they are politically independent of what Congress and what the White House do. And then we have to also create an independent national laboratory. And I have been talking to my colleagues anytime I speak to environmentalists. Why have they not gotten together and created an independent laboratory? In fact, the environmentalists can do it right now. They don't need any government approval. And then they can go at their own time in grocery stores and buy vegetables and meat and so on, and then test this stuff for all the more than 100 different active ingredients, and then publish the results immediately. And those results, if you knew what you were eating, you would not be eating what you're eating. Would you? I don't think so, especially strawberries. My gosh. So what does it mean in practical terms? It means that you should start eating organic food. That's the only thing that we have that protects us from these chemicals. To some degree, you can't have 100% protection because the stuff moves by the air. And if you have a 2-acre farm, organic farm right here, and then 10 miles further you have 50-acre farm that uses everything, and if the wind goes this way, the stuff will drop down there. In fact, less than 0.1% of the actual stuff that they spray ever reaches the weed or the insect that they want to kill. Most of it becomes airborne and travels throughout the universe, throughout the world. And so we have Eskimos, for instance, having DDT in their blood. Why? They don't have any agriculture. How did they get there? How did the DDT get there? It's because of this global movement. And so you create an independent EPA and also have the laboratory to begin to do this assessment of what we eat and publish the results. That will embarrass the hell out of all these food companies, and then that will at least boost the industry that says it's organic, and they will produce more and more. The prices will come down, and then the big guys that want the money, your money, they will begin probably to reorganize themselves. In fact, a couple of days ago, Peter and I went to a meeting here about water, right? And I asked the question, I said, look, agribusiness is using about 90% of your drinking water. Why don't we use this emergency of the drought that is already in California to insist that those who want to get the federally subsidized water in California, they have to break up their massive empires to reasonable pieces, maybe 200 acres. You pick up a number, I don't know. The smaller the better as far as I'm concerned. And then we need to rethink it, to think about these terms, because just to focus on pesticides is a dead end. Pesticides, remember, are nothing but a tool to this guy to protect and to preserve their big empire. That's the purpose. Yes?
So, historically speaking, plants have always, just for an example, we used to have over 200 plus kinds of apple in the United States, and now we're limited to maybe a dozen or 20, right? And natural crossbreeding between plants have occurred, and that's where natural resistance, it seems to come up. And so hybridization has always been a part of things, So how is it that we could perhaps bring natural occurring things back into, I'm looking solutions, right? So how do you bring in natural solutions to resistance back to the forefront? Because that doesn't make money. That's the bottom line, right? The reason it's a corporation, they make money. So how do you shift it back to what naturally has occurred for thousands and thousands of years? I'm looking for a solution for you. What do you think could really?
The solution, I already suggested it. Begin to eat organic food.
But
if enough of us ate organic food, that would immediately be a landmark that we don't want any more of the junk food that they actually sell.
But it's on, and I agree with you, but on a different level of just for example, the other day I was down at a store and I really loved the employees that we get in a conversation, and I was going there because they have organic and they have a juice bar down the way that is not organic, and they said that they go and buy their juice down there. They said, because who cares about organic? They're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to educate somebody there, right? But so how do you get the masses out there to understand it? That's the thing. I mean, we're all highly educated here in Marin, okay? We're really lucky.
I say, I mean, I make a modest proposal, read my book. I mean, it's the story. You need to have, how to put it, your metaphysics, your assumptions about the world have to change.
Yeah.
So far, we go to the store, we assume that by eating a cheeseburger, it's okay, good for us. But if you know what goes into the meat, then you wouldn't test that product again, ever. So if they get the message, the people that produce the food, they would say, for us, it's better to begin to become more ecological, because ecological will pay. And believe me, not only that, but the ecological costs are horrendous. I briefly mentioned the idea of honeybees, right? Honeybees. Honeybees pollinate about a third of all the crops we use. And if you put money next to that, it's about $25 billion per year. I measured that honeybees also are on the verge of extinction. What does that tell you? That there are enough stuff in the air, enough poisons, that the honeybees just can't make it. So, and then, okay, you don't have any problem with honeybees, but let's think about you, humans. 45% of Americans get or die from cancer. Do we need to wait until 90% die? And then we're going to say, oh, we need more hospitals, and more hospitals for babies getting cancer, that sort of thing. And and then we face the global warming, right? Global warming is coming, but it hasn't really hit us yet. We have a drought now, and that's an indication something is very wrong. But believe me, global warming it's a horrendous, catastrophe coming up. But the disaster I have been describing so far, to me, is the mother of all crises. Because why? Because it's our life at stake, and we have been dealing with this for almost more than 60 years. If you take Rachel Carson as a landmark, 1962, and I wrote this book 50 years later, what does that tell you about us? Thinking about it and acting. So this is what the story is all about. Number one, yes, sir. That's okay.
I just wanted to suggest one possible answer to your question. People will buy things that they can afford.
No, I agree.
And they tend to be able to afford things that are produced by large agribusiness because, in part, large federal farm subsidies that support that industry. So in order to make competitive, smaller farm businesses that provide a greater diversity of food, isn't one important part of the solution is to end federal farm subsidies to agribusiness?
Yeah, I would say it's about $25 billion, by the way, as we speak, $25 billion. If I had anything to do with the government and to determine this money, I would give it only to people that have less than 160 acres of land. I would buy that land and train the people and get more farmers. We have the farm workers, and I heard in Florida this April, I went on a tour of farm workers, and the lady who was talking to us, she was quoting a mega farmer in Florida who said, the farm workers, he said, we used to have slaves. Now we rent the slaves, meaning that the farm workers are the slaves we rent. So instead of having slaves that we rent, why don't we make these farm workers into farmers? Give them 2-3 acres of land, and you can spread democracy, you can spread food diversity, and you can spread good quality food all over the country. Yes?
It's very nice to listen to a human being. I don't feel like I do that very often these days. And I love your reflections and your deep thought so much. I just feel like I'm listening to sense instead of nonsense. I was wondering if you could talk about the link to autism and Alzheimer's as well.
Well, I mentioned the honeybees dying out of neurotoxins. And neurotoxins are pervasive. This neonicotinoids is just another evolution from parathyroid. And this causes problems with the central nervous system, plus our brains. And all the disease you describe is a neurological disease. And most of the impact comes through what we eat and the water we drink. So it's water and food. If we can clean up the mess, I think then you're going to see a dramatic decline in most of these neurological diseases. And indeed, I'm getting very furious when I meet doctors, medical doctors, who should be on the forefront, and they pretend that they are too busy to do other things, and they don't actually even teach toxicology to their students or nutrition to their students. So the students never make the connection. And so, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have a question about, kind of relates to her question. Durspan is chlorpyrifos. It was banned by the EPA, but only for domestic use. For some reason, it does not protect farm workers' children, but it was aimed to protect children in general against central nervous system problems, both in the development and maturation. But how could they ban it? It was the EPA. How could they ban only for domestic use and not for agricultural use? How can they do that?
I cannot legitimize or justify or even explain why they do these kind of crazy things. And I already gave you a background about the kind of potential fraud in the decision and regulatory processes. Let me just elaborate on this a little bit further so you can understand what I'm saying. If you read the so-called Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, this is the title of the official law that regulates these pesticides. You go to Section 18 that talks about emergency exemption. Well, you say, that's good, emergency exemption. If there's an emergency, we can make an exception. But what do you think it means? What do you think it does in actual practice? Let's take a hypothetical case that the governor of California, or other farmers went to the governor of California and said, hey, Mr. Brown, you know this chemical we use, the glyphosate, let's say, is becoming ineffective. It creates all the super weeds, right? And so we need to use this other chemical, which has never been tested. And the governor of California agrees with these guys, and he writes a letter to EPA. And EPA immediately, by law, by the Section 18, can say, go ahead and do it. And guess what they do? They use untested chemicals for 6 months to 6 years, and not a report to anybody. So they keep dumping on you stuff that should never have been used. And then, related to this fraud, let me suggest another thing. You hear about glyphosate being the active ingredient of Roundup, right? Roundup. Now, the farmer never uses glyphosate, really. What he uses is glyphosate plus another 10, 20 different stuff, including petroleum distillates that are by definition carcinogens. And those chemicals, EPA brands them as inerts, I-N-E-R-T-S, inerts, like this, water. And yet they can be more toxic than the actual poison that we all talk about, the glyphosate. This is what I mean. It's a situation that is completely outrageous, which is why I said we need to get out of pesticides by eating organic food. And bring the organic food to our children in schools, high schools, expand it all over.
Well, I don't know if people, I live in Berkeley, and we have an emergency, right? They want to clear cut the East Bay Hills, 500,000 trees, and the excuse is fire. So they want to dump garland and glyphosate, Roundup on us for 10 years.
Twice a year.
Yeah, so they're always fabricating an emergency.
Yes, yes.
It seems to me that federal subsidies of agriculture are upside down. I mean, if anybody has grown any organic food, you know that it's very hard to get a huge yield on your crop. You've got a lot of lost bugs, you've got a lot of lost, birds and animals who come and raid it. And yet when the farmers are pouring pesticides, they're getting very high yields in crops. It's the organic farmers who need the subsidy. And what we need to do is go to our commerce people and tell them that we need the organic farmers to get the subsidy.
Perfect. You said
And
it
so
beautifully.
you stop using pesticides and you farm organically and you will get the subsidies.
Yeah.
And you will turn agribusiness. It's like I read somewhere that people were upset about what General Mills was doing with getting their children, if they were eating Lucky Charms, to go on Facebook, and that they started just bombarding the internet on Facebook, and they actually got them to back off. And in fact, a number of those nasty cereals are actually starting to take things out of their products because they are being perceived as unhealthy. So if we can go as a radical situation right to the Congress and say, look, this doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't.
It doesn't make any sense, but let me also address the question about productivity. You know, the small farmer is more productive than the large farmer. The propaganda has been that the larger, the better, the more productive, we're going to feed people in Africa and Asia. That's nonsense. By definition and scientific studies, the smaller guy is more productive than the large guy because he knows this is his life. He's still alive. It's 160 or less. It's still his life, a way of life. Now, the man who grows, say, 500 acres of onions, you have endless rows of onions and they spray 10, 20 different insecticides or fungicides or herbicides.
But we need to spread that whole message because the monocrops and everything where they're just plowing out, the whole Central Valley now is full of wine, of grape vineyards for wine. It's crazy.
Okay, I guess I'm getting to the point that I have spoken too long.
May I say one last thing? I don't know if you're aware, but
Yes.
Last week, Proposition 65, our Cal EPA recommendation for cancer causing, glyphosate and malathion were both requested to be on that list. So that's in the process here in the state of California. I just want to let you know.
Okay.
This got recommended last week to be on the Prop 65 carcinogen list. Both glyphosate and malathion.
Good, but we have known about the carcinogenicity for decades. Yeah.
I'm just trying to say that's something that she can take to her council and say, you're about to put a known carcinogen in the state of California on our trees, so you're about to cut down. Try to help Berkeley over there.
I thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate being here. I appreciate Lori's invitation to come and share some of a little bit of my research, but research of a lot of other scientists. If you read the no consensus on GMO and glyphosate, you'll find I think it's up to 1,700 signatures now of scientists that we recognize that the product hasn't been evaluated properly. I appreciate Evaggelos and comparing notes and that. But what I want to address for you tonight is the issue that you have with from an environmental standpoint. We talk about agriculture and production. Right now, the issue before you is more an environmental aspect rather than necessarily agricultural food. So I'll address that and the impact that that's going to have and does have on you that essentially goes totally unignored at the present time. And so I gave you that title of Man, Mud, Water, and Wildlife, and that because it has the same impact on you that it has on them. And we can go right through it. But you have a beautiful community, a beautiful area that needs proper stewardship. You have to look, if we can have the next slide, you look at all of that opportunity that you have to get away from the regular grind of life and get back, start putting things in perspective and getting the values back into the system. You have a beautiful area again. Next. But you have to realize that that area is part of an ecology. We don't just go around shooting bullets at every little pest or challenge that we have. When you're using a chemical, you're using a silver bullet approach. You're not managing the ecology, and you're forgetting that ecology is made of the plants, man and wildlife, that physical environment, and a very dynamic biological environment. All of them very critical to have them mesh together. You can't do one thing without changing the interaction with all four of those components in that ecological diamond. Next slide. A lot of those interactions involve nutrients. When you have a plant species, it will have a preference for certain nutrients. It will give off certain nutrients in its root exudates that then feed that biological component that's in the soil that's holding that soil together, keeping it from liquefying. One of the characteristics of the serpentine soil is that it liquefies. In other words, there's not enough structure in it so that when you get a little bit of water, it's just like putting sugar into a glass of water and it starts to flow for you. The nutrients are important not only as components of those plants and the animals that eat it, and the insects and the organisms, but they're also the critical regulators for physiological processes. All of our herbicides are compounds that we call chelators. Chelator is a compound that can grab onto another element and change its physical characteristics. For the herbicides, they're chelators that then immobilize those nutrients so they're not available for those physiological processes. They're the keys, and I've likened them to having those enzymes in our bodies or in a deer's body or bacteria, kind of like a very powerful engine. That engine doesn't do any work at all till you turn the key on. The micronutrients and many of the macronutrients are the keys or the cofactors that turn that engine on. That's why herbicides are effective, is because they pull the key out of the ignition so that that engine can't run. Now we refer to herbicides as ALS inhibitors or photosynthetic inhibitors or shikimate inhibitors based on the physiology, based on the engines, but it should be based on the keys. They're zinc chelators, they're manganese chelators, they're iron chelators, they're cobalt chelators. They're also involved in that whole process of nutrition, because if it's chelated so it can't work in a physiological function there, it's not going to be a proper food for your deer, for your fish, or for any of your rabbits or any of the other natural elements, entities that are out there. But I want to emphasize that most of our herbicides are very narrow spectrum chelators for copper or zinc or iron. When it comes to glyphosate, it's a very broad spectrum chelator that chelates any of the positively charged ions. So copper, zinc, manganese, nickel, cobalt, all of those nutrients are all reduced in their efficiency and their uptake and availability for any biological function. Next slide. You have a series of challenges and considerations that you need to use. You're faced with a tremendous fire potential when you have a lot of vegetation on the surface, a lot of trees, a lot of bushes, a lot of grass. It's a fire potential. At the same time, you're faced with a soil that doesn't have any aluminum in it or any clay. So that structurally, when it gets wet, it liquefies, it flows. And so you have mudslides. Now the things that we would typically do for fire are the things that damage or that increase your mudslide potential. You're going to reduce that cover on the soil or the root systems and that from your plants. Broom has a very deep root system. It's a very important weed for you, but it's a very important plant. It's out of control, so that it needs to be reined in. Eucalyptus, been a very important tree as far as the windbreak. There needs to be some considerations on it. But you also have to remember that it's not just fire potential, you've got mudslides. You've got hillsides that aren't going to stay there if you did everything that you wanted to do for fire. And so what you look at then is the ecology, and you say, okay, these things are my highest fire potential. They're important over here, but what are the alternatives that I have? Are there some things that I can plant in place of some of the species that are out there? Are there plants that will compete with the broom? And there are. Both plants that have an allelopathic characteristic, in other words, they produce their own pesticide or their own herbicide in preventing weed seed germination, so that they're kind of king of the roost. Eucalyptus is kind of that way, black walnut. That's why you don't have a lot of weeds under your eucalyptus, is because it has some allelopathic potential. There are other characteristics that you can use, but the plant has to be adapted to the soil. The reason that broom is an aggressive invasive species is that it tolerates high nickel. In fact, it needs high nickel in order for that symbiotic nitrogen fixation to take place for ureide synthesis. That's why your legumes do very well. Well, are there legumes that you could use as cover crops that are native species that you could use that are going to hold the soil, feed those bacteria that are in the soil that are producing the polysaccharides and the fungi that are producing the glomalin and the other components there that give you soil structure? And there are. It's a matter of saying, okay, I don't want to use the silver bullet because of all the consequences, kind of like shooting the horse that you need to ride to get to town on, just because he bellyached at you a little bit. You have some wildlife that are very important in that overall ecology, and that goes from the smallest entity to some pretty big entities that are out there, but this resource that you have in this ecology also provides your water. So if you're going to contaminate your water, you're going to have that same tragedy that we're experiencing in Yakima, Washington right now, with the 3 rivers that go through, and you have babies being born with anencephaly, which is only half of the brain. They're usually born stillborn, major epidemic. So that what you're looking for is you have all of these considerations, and then you look at some of the alternatives that you might have, and you develop a system that's adapted to your area that meets all the criteria. I can assure you that glyphosate isn't one of them. You're going the wrong direction. I think it's a chemical that has a very short life expectancy because of the damage that's being done. And I'll get into some of that. Next. So that in spring glyphosate, we have to notify, and there'll be a notice of pesticide application. It's been listed as the most chronically toxic chemical that has ever been released into the environment. That wasn't Monsanto's determination. EPA's determination said in raising the tolerance levels for glyphosate in most of our food crops and feed materials here in May to 4,000 times higher than they were in 1974 when they were basing it on research. Monsanto's statement was, we don't do any independent research. We rely solely on the statements of the companies that these new levels are safe. Now you've heard Evaggelos over here. Look at him out here with very little protection. This guy has the protection. He's probably going to die of heat prostration before very long in your environment. I've worn those suits many times. Next slide. Glyphosate, and we'll focus on it because that's the issue that I was asked to. First patented in 1974 is a very powerful mineral chelator. Grabs onto the mineral nutrients and it immobilizes them so it shuts down physiological processes. It's indiscriminate. That's why it was such a powerful chelator and used to clean boilers and steam pipes. That's what it was patented for. 1974, because it's a strong mineral chelator, to pull the key out of the ignition for physiological processes, it was patented by Monsanto in 1974 again as an herbicide. Those physiological processes have to have minerals as the cofactor. In 2000, it was patented because it was a mineral chelator as a very powerful broad-spectrum antibiotic. Why do you think we have antibiotic resistance now in many of our organisms, our microorganisms? If it's resistant, develops resistance to glyphosate, it will probably be resistant to all other antibiotics that we're working with, because it's such a broad spectrum antibiotic that it covers all of the groups and all of the classes of activity. It's a very broad spectrum environmental impact.
Do you want questions afterwards?
What?
Afterwards?
Yeah,
Okay.
So that if you look at it, it's an antibiotic against the good guys. Those bacteria and fungi, your mycorrhizae, your nitrogen-fixing bacteria, your natural biological control organisms against our soil-borne pathogens, and all of the good guys, but it's not active against the pathogens. So that your fusarium, your phytophthora, your pythium, and your rhizoctonia, and your cornospora, all of those other very serious pathogens of our crops and our plants are resistant to glyphosate. So you take out all of those natural organisms that would suppress their activity, and then you have what we call an epidemic of Phytophthora ramorum on your oaks. Wasn't a serious problem before you had high exposure to glyphosate. It's a very persistent compound. It's detoxified as an herbicide within 2 or 3 weeks after application to the plant or the soil. Not poof and you're gone as you see in the ad. But it is detoxified because it's a very powerful chelator with the calcium and magnesium and iron and other minerals that are in the soil. So that it may not be an active herbicide, but it's still a very active chemical as an antibiotic. And then later on can be desorbed. That chelation can be broken 10 or 15 or 20 years later if you're adding phosphate fertilizers or if you're doing some other things environmentally, that chelation can be broken, and then you have a very active herbicide again to start taking out those beneficial organisms or beneficial plants that you've brought in to give you protection from your mudslides, give you that cover. Persistence is because of that organic phosphate. All of those are very difficult to degrade. There are very few organisms that can do that. Monsanto's lost both lawsuits that by claiming that it was biodegradable. We know that it can be degraded, but it's an unpredictable entity because it's by co-metabolism rather than by nutritional benefit. Next slide. So that they said it only inhibits the EPSPS enzyme down here, but glyphosate actually inhibits 291 enzymes. That's just the ones that have been looked at. A broad spectrum immobilizer of the cofactors for those enzymes. And half of those are more severely inhibited, and they are in our body, very essential for us. This one is very essential for us, even though we don't have the shikimate pathway, the lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, and your enterococcus. All of those beneficial organisms that support and provide your immune system and nutrient availability are all dependent on the EPSPS system. So you shut all of that down. Shuts down in your deer, in your mice, in your other organisms, in your bees. And so we have colony collapse, we have chronic botulism, we have all of the human diseases then that are related and require functional GI tract. In fact, Ross Billing, or an old poet during the pioneer days, made the statement at one time that he was old enough that he realized that a good functional set of bowels is worth a whole pile of brains. If you have gluten intolerance, if you have leaky gut, or if you have Crohn's or any of those diseases, or autism or Alzheimer's, depending on that dopamine or Parkinson's and that, you have an appreciation for that statement because it all goes back there. Next slide. It only takes a half an ounce, less than a half an ounce of glyphosate per acre to inhibit the uptake by 50% of iron and manganese, by 80%, but then the translocation of manganese, iron, and zinc, essential nutrients for your oat, for your lupin, for your bird's eye trefoil. Any of those native plants still have to have nutrients for their physiology to function. A half an ounce is all that it takes to inhibit the translocation and uptake of those essential nutrients plus a whole bunch more. So you're starving your plants, you're stimulating the pathogens, and no wonder that we're seeing all of the disease that's adding to the tinder from a fire standpoint. Next slide. I mentioned that it can be adsorbed into the soil through chelation, and then it can be desorbed. And that can be desorbed by amino acids and root exudates, by phosphorus fertilizers, by a number of other things that will desorb, and then you get that herbicidal activity. Much more damaging to the roots than it is the top of the plant. So the plant may look pretty good, but it's not doing anything to keep that mud from moving. Next slide. I have farmers all the time that tell me that plants don't look as good as they used to. They get the stand, and this is what you hear when you go Parks and Recreation or Rangers and whatnot, say, well, really don't see much difference, it must be okay. You only have half the root system. You have hidden hunger, because those roots are important for scavenging the nutrients. You don't have an abundance of nutrients in your serpentine soil. You got more nickel than you need, and it's toxic to many plants, but your legumes have a high requirement, and that's why they're the competitors. That's why they're established. And to replace broom, then you need to look at those plants that are well established to the specific environment that you're addressing. Next slide. Glyphosate's a systemic chemical. You're going to have about 16% that goes off into the environment, the air and the water. and it's gonna spread. If you're putting out a pound per acre, which is the recommended label rate for most of the uses that you would have here, you get a tough weed and you boot that up. I noticed on one of the studies it said 1 to 4 pounds per acre. Well, that's 450 grams per pound. It takes 12 grams to inhibit the uptake and availability of those nutrients to get your plants established so that you can hold that soil up on the hillside. It's systemic. You get a little bit of it on the plant and it distributes itself throughout the plant. It accumulates in the reproductive structures and in the growth points, the shoot tip and the root tip, your legume nodules. Those are the entities that the grain or the product, the seeds that are produced, very important for your birds. For your other animals, that's where glyphosate accumulates. So that you put it out there and that increases the dosage for those wild animals and for those parts of the aesthetic ecology that tie in and have an important role to play. Glyphosate moves down into the root system, compromises the plant's resistance to the soil-borne diseases, and that's how it works, as an herbicide. Stimulates then those soil-borne pathogens as pathogens to more rapidly colonize and kill the plant. It's the pathogens that kill the plant. And so we see 40 diseases that we know are increased by glyphosate. It doesn't matter whether it's Roundup Ready plant or not. They're still those diseases are still stimulated because we've increased the virulence of the pathogens. Reduces nutrient uptake. You look at all of the beneficial biologicals that are very sensitive to it. You change the ecology in every aspect. Next slide. One of the plans said we're going to cut down the eucalyptus and we're going to put glyphosate on the stumps so we don't get sprouting. It's a systemic chemical. Going to stay in the plant for as long as the plant's alive. That's 60% of it. If you lose 16% to air and water, you lose about 20% to the soil through the root exudates, and the rest of it's in the plant. Okay, when that plant deteriorates, it's going to free up that glyphosate because it hasn't been degraded in the plant. And then if you go out and you dump on a bunch of it, because you're using a concentrated solution, and you're going to essentially kill all the plants that are anywhere those roots are. For a eucalyptus tree, you're going to have 100 to 150 foot area that you're going to have damage to your adjacent plants because it moves through the roots. It's a very water-soluble compound, very systemic then in the plants. And as those roots decompose, you're going to have that whole area of the soil then that is contaminated and exposed to the glyphosate. All of that biology that we want and that we're trying to build up can be negatively impacted. Next slide. Again, you can't kill a plant with glyphosate in sterile soil. It's the fungi, those soil-borne pathogens that are stimulated to be more powerful pathogens that do the killing. Next slide. There's no question you have to have serious consideration for the fire potential. But when you just focus on fire and don't also focus on the mud, it's kind of like choosing your poison. I encourage you to look at the ecology. Look at what's involved, because there are alternatives. There are plenty of ways that you can balance. and make that system work for you and maintain the aesthetics as well as the overall environment to control it. A serious problem, and I don't want to negate it, or I don't want to imply that it's not a serious concern. Next slide. Because it is. But there are a lot of different things you can do to address it, and you're doing a lot of those. Next slide. Certainly, if you look at before and after glyphosate application, you have to say which one's going to provide the most fuel. Certainly a dry, desiccated plant burns a whole lot hotter and faster than one that's actively growing and active there. Next slide. Sudden oak death provides a tremendous amount of fuel for a fire. Your phytophthora is increased and enhanced by changing that soil biology, by stimulating the virulence of it. This is a plant that you want to keep. Goes a long way to holding that soil up. So that there's a lot of tinder there, a lot of BTUs sitting there waiting to be ignited. Next slide. You can see it here, the same thing with your oak wilt and sudden oak death. That, again, phytophthora diseases. Next slide. You see the number of diseases that are increased. All of your scorch type diseases are increased by glyphosate. All of your Xylella fastidiosa, it's a bacterial pathogen, plugs up the vascular system, so you get desiccation from the disease. Next slide. What happens to water use efficiency? This is glyphosate free. This is where glyphosate's been applied. It takes twice as much water for a plant to produce a pound of dry matter when you treat it with glyphosate as it does without it. You're in a drought. Those plants are already stressed from a fire standpoint. You're going to further intensify that drought stress when they apply the glyphosate, because it doesn't stay just on the broom or the weeds. It's a systemic chemical, water-soluble chemical, very persistent chemical. Next slide. See the same thing on corn. These two fields are separated by a 60-foot gravel road. Same soil, same weather, but look at the tremendous difference in that water use efficiency and drought stress that can lead to desiccation. Next slide. I mentioned holding the soil on the hillside. That's a biological function, and this is kind of a schematic of what it takes to get microaggregation and aggregation of that soil so that it's sticking there, and also so that it can let the water penetrate, so that your water isn't running off to give you sheet erosion, but it's there so that the plants then can use it. It can hold it, because you have the aggregated structure to it. And these are the different components, and you look at your mold mycelia and your earthworm activity and your bacterial gums. Again, it's part of that ecology that you need to consider in context, rather than just grabbing a silver bullet and say this is going to solve all my problems, because it's going to shoot you in the foot. Next slide. Again, it's a very powerful biocide for your beneficial organisms. You can see as you apply your glyphosate, how they drop. Here's your pathogen, 500% greater root infection with fusarium. It causes sudden death syndrome when you apply glyphosate to a Roundup ready plant. So it's not limited to, or not selective in that area. Next slide. You can see the interaction of glyphosate in our serpentine soils. You see that tremendous impact from a biological standpoint, but also you need to replace the broom with another adapted variety. You have your lupins, you have vetch, you have trefoil, you have white clovers that are all native to California. All of them will tolerate and actually benefit competitively with your that high nitrogen or high nickel content in your soil. So you've got some alternatives. It's a matter of managing that and moving them into the system to compete with the broom. Keep that 50-year seed bank of broom that you've got sitting out there dormant by keeping the ground cover with some of these other low-growing legumes. Next slide. Again, just showing some of your serpentine soils. You've got plenty of them in the area. Next slide. You can see this is 6 years of organic, no glyphosate. 6 years with glyphosate. This is after an inch of rain, and you can see how the water can't penetrate because that soil aggregation has been destroyed, and it just runs off. You get glyphosate moving off, you get all the other stuff, as well as your soil moving. Next slide. So that there are a lot of food and feed safety concerns. Next slide. You see that reduced nutrient density that you're going to feed your wildlife with and your native organisms. You've only got half of the sulfur. How are you going to have any amino acids produced, any proteins produced without methionine, cysteine, sulfur amino acids? Next slide. You can see it in all the others. This is the effect. You can, Eb Pedersen in Denmark has measured for the last 10 years, he's measured the amount of glyphosate in his feed and then recorded the incidence of birth defects, and he can tell you that for every 0.014 parts per million glyphosate in the feed, he has a 5% increase in each of these diseases, whether it's soft tissue, whether it's limbs, spinal, or cranial deformities, any of those, he can tell you the exact ingestion amount that's going to do that. Next slide. Again, it's a very powerful antibiotic. So that you see all of these organisms that are very beneficial for us and that keep us healthy because they're the means of suppressing all of these pathogens. All of these are taken out of the GI tract when you have 1/10 of a part per million glyphosate exposure. These are all resistant to glyphosate. You have gut dysbiosis. You have chronic botulism or toxical infection. You have all of the other problems. Next slide. And so in cattle, same thing in deer. You see that chronic botulism. Glyphosate's toxic to all of those organisms that would normally suppress your Clostridium botulinum so that there's no neurotoxin produced. At 1/10 of a part per million, you see the Clostridium developing, and you see that neurotoxin that eventually kills the animal. It's called chronic fatigue in humans. It's called sudden infant death syndrome in humans because the baby hasn't had an opportunity to develop that beneficial or protective GI tract mechanism there, the lactobacillus, the bifidobacter in that. Next slide. You can see cancer. The World Health Organization just labeled it 2A as a probable human carcinogen. They didn't have access to the Monsanto studies in 1981 and 1983 that are now available and hopefully will be reviewed in the review of glyphosate, that Monsanto's own studies document that glyphosate is a carcinogen. If you read the EPA report, where Evaggelos is, if you read the EPA report on that, you'll find that the question was raised by the EPA scientists, why isn't the EPA interested in the carcinogenicity of this compound in their evaluation in 1983? You see that effect, but then you look at the National Cancer Institute's annual report. All of these areas of types of cancers that we're seeing a major increase in almost epidemiological proportions of, all are target areas for glyphosate. We've made a little progress down here with smoking and the lung cancers and those materials, but they're all target areas for glyphosate. Well documented. Next slide. You have the serial lineage study that, even though it was redacted through pressure from the industry, been republished, and the European Food Service Authority has said its protocols are the ones that we feel are the most adequate, most applicable for evaluating a carcinogenic compound, even though it didn't go or didn't have the full 50 rats. You didn't have to. These rats were developing the mammary tumors and liver and kidney tumors at the equivalent age of 45. On the controls, it was the equivalent age of 73 to 75. Next slide. Your mudslides again are a serious concern. You have to look at how do you stabilize that soil? How do you hold it? There's where your biology and where your plant system comes into play. You can't just say, I'm only going to focus on fire, because you've also got a very serious other problem here. Next slide. And so if you look at glyphosate as a wildlife poison, look at Judy Hoy, wildlife biologist reports, and these are the areas of toxicity that she sees commonly in sheep and deer and elk. This spring, we had a situation we have never seen before, where for deer and elk, the does were still running with the bucks in the spring. We still had herds because none of them were pregnant. The infertility level has reached a point, as Judy said, that the deer or the wolves and the hunters are a minor factor in the decline of our wildlife compared to glyphosate. Next slide. And so you can see that. You can see the tumors on these different birds. Next slide. You see it up here on this pine siskin. Next slide. Just to show you a lot of those. Here's another cancer over here on the male house finch. Next. And you see that shortened beak. You see the deformed mouth, the underbite on the animals. They can't feed. They can't get that nourishment. They're prey, or they're fodder for animals, but they also die from malnutrition. The same thing with babies. And you go to a large maternity ward, and it'll shock you at how many cleft palates we have, how many spinal bifida, and how many other malformations from the endocrine hormone disruption of this very powerful chemical. Next slide. You see it here in the animals. You can see that underbite can't properly get the food, harvest the food. Next slide. And you see that, again, that malformation of the teeth and underbite on that. Next slide. So that you see the dead birds, primarily from liver cancer, but you'll see a lot of other factors that come into play in that. Next slide. You see also in the fish, Especially you'll see the liver cancers in the fish that from glyphosate exposure at quite low rates. It's a chronic toxin, not an acute one. Next slide. Then you have the bees, and chronic or colony collapse has three characteristics: lower mineral availability. They don't have the ability then to digest the honey and the bee bread because they don't have the lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. And then you also have that endocrine hormone disruption, all three of those from glyphosate. And then you throw the neonicotinoid insecticides on top of that as also powerful endocrine hormone disruptors, and we're in serious problem with 50% of our natural pollinators that have been eliminated from our environment. Next slide. And so you can look at that in a normal honey crop. You'll see it's all liquid, all fluid in there. This would be the bee's stomach with the lactobacillus and the bifidobacteria so that the bee is able to utilize that nutrient. But when you get the glyphosate there, take the lactobacillus bifidobacteria out, then you end up with just a bunch of gravel essentially because it can't be digested. The same thing for us. You get that stomach ache, and eventually you'll see the tissues die from mineral deficiency. Next slide. And so we have major die-off of our bees, and it's very serious problems from a pollination standpoint. You're shipping in bees from Florida to pollinate and Canada to pollinate your almonds. Can't get enough. There aren't enough available to do the job, to do everything that you'd like to do. Next slide. And then we have the tragedy in Yakima. They had invasive weed species in the 3 rivers that go through the county. Decided that it was probably more important to apply this quote-unquote safe chemical that EPA has approved to dump in the water called glyphosate. They started doing that in 2008, and by 2010 you have a major epidemic of anencephaly where only half the brain develops, and the baby is usually stillborn, or if it lives you have 24 to 48 hours that you get to hold your baby. Personal tragedies. That's on top of 30% infertility. And that infertility isn't just for the Yakima. That's a 30% drop in the last 5 years for the U.S. in male and female fertility. You see all of that, and along with this, you still see the spinal bifida and all the other problems that are associated with that endocrine hormone disruption. Next slide. U.S. Cattlemen's Associations recognize that in our cattle, 40 to 50% of the pregnancies are being lost. Premature aging. The CDC said our children are going to have a shorter lifetime than we do. Never happened before in history. What's happening to our medicine? What's happening to our children and posterity? Next slide. You can see this survey of dairies from Mexico through Canada. They've said, why are so many cows losing pregnancies? Well, 50%, according to the Cattlemen's Association, isn't unusual, and that's what you see here. Those that were pregnant, those that are now open, about a 50%. You see the same thing in deer. That's why we had all of those herds running together this spring, because they couldn't reproduce. Look at the number of services that are required. It's time, it's resource, lost opportunity from a production standpoint. So that you say, well, we're going to spray it and it's not going to be a real problem for us because it's chelated or poof and it's gone as a toxic herbicide. It's not poof and it's gone as a powerful antibiotic. as a mineral chelator. So that as you use your parks and your recreation areas and these other areas, you have a lot of dust. That glyphosate's in that dust. So then your exposure level goes up. Next slide. You have resistant weeds, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The more glyphosate you use, the quicker you're going to develop those resistant weeds, and then what are you going to use? Not only that, when you have a weed that's resistant to glyphosate, it's a whole lot more difficult to control and kill with anything else that we have. Next slide. You look at this curve, and real quickly, that's the epidemiological pattern for celiac in children. It's bad enough that it requires hospitalization. You can trace it right back to when they released GMO canola, and you started increasing that 5 to 15% increase in exposure to glyphosate. Next slide. That same curve fits all of these diseases. Epidemiologically, and I've served on the Surgeon General's Global Epidemiology Working Group for a number of years, I don't know of any single factor that even comes close to matching that epidemiological pattern that we see with glyphosate. Now, correlation isn't necessarily causation, but I can tell you when you get 32 diseases that fit the same curve and don't fit anything else that we know of, there are other contributing factors with a lot of these. Aluminum and a lot of those things are all contributing. They don't fit the same correlation. Again, you can look at all of those diseases and you see this is CDC data on the incidence of the disease. This is USDA data on the glyphosate. So you can argue with the data, but it's all government data.
So in the East Bay, they say when they're painting the stumps with the garland and glyphosate, it's okay, but it goes through the roots, right?
Goes right through the roots, throughout the soil,
Okay,
and a very powerful biocide.
okay, thank you.
Not only that, but as it goes out, it also takes out those plants through the root exudates. As it leaks out of those roots, it's going to take out any plants that come in contact with it.
Including the natives.
You can see all of the areas for toxicity. These are all good clinical studies. We've known this for many years as far as what the toxicity of this chemical is. Next slide. You can calculate that dietary risk index for glyphosate on a 0 to 100 is 82.7. The neonics insecticides are 14.9. All other pesticides together are less than 0.1 as far as what your exposure and intake is. The same thing for your animals and the wildlife. Next slide. Let's go. This is the increased probability of these diseases as a result of just the glyphosate that's in soybeans. Next slide. It accumulates in the body and the brain, breast milk, bones, heart, liver, and kidney. You'll have more in those tissues than you have in the urine. Well, look at the difference between the European levels in urine and what we have. Tells you what your exposure level is. And then look at what's in breast milk, what's in your drinking water, and what it requires then from a baby standpoint or developing fetus. Next slide. Again, you have a beautiful area. You have some invasive weeds, and you have some concerns, but please address it by addressing the ecology. And remember that you can't do one thing without interacting with all aspects of that ecology. Look outside the box. Number of things that can be done, need to be done. May take a little more management. Mostly it takes a little more thought and willingness to get out of the box. The old sign in Idaho going from Mountain Home to Hill City says, choose your rut wisely. It was a dirt road, Highway 69. Said, choose your rut wisely. The only difference between a rut and a grave is 6 feet. So, next slide, I think that's, we better stop. These are some of the alternatives, some of the ground covers. Reduce your tinder, but keep that ground covered. Good root systems on them. These are just some examples. At parks and recreation today, compliment them. Sarah said she's been looking and watching the plants that are doing really well and surviving. One of them's a lupin. Very excellent legume, very well adapted to these soils that you have here. Very excellent for holding the soil, for feeding those microorganisms that you want to aggregate it. Next slide. I'll tell this, Lori's gone, so maybe I can get away with a minute. But the story told of a woman that had lost her husband 15, 16 years before, became fairly lonely, and her children were concerned that she might get depressed because with age and everything. And so they suggested that she get a pet. And she took that to heart, drove over to Boise to the pet store and explained her situation to the pet store owner. And he grabbed her by the arm and he took her to the back of the pet store and showed her this beautiful Brazilian parrot and said, this guy's exactly what you need. Said he'll talk to you, keep you company, you can shower your emotions on him, it gives you something that you have to do. And so she bought the parrot, took it home, came back the next day and said, well, he hasn't said anything to me. What do I need to do? Pet store owner said, oh, parrots like to move around. You have some stairs. Bought the stairs, put them in the cage, came back the second day with, and said, still hasn't said anything to me. And so pet store owner said, oh, he said, you have a swing. He bought the swing, put it in the cage, came back the third day and said he still hasn't said anything. What am I doing wrong? Pet store owner said, oh, he said, parrots have a high vanity quotient. It's kind of like asking the EPA to change a decision. He said, you have a mirror. And so she bought the mirror and put it in the cage, came back the fourth day with a dead parrot and said, he hardly said anything, he just kind of mumbled something and healed over dead. The pet store owner thought a minute and he said, well, what did he say? What did it sound like? She said, well, I'm not quite sure, but it's something like, doesn't that store sell any food? So sometimes we get focused on one thing and we forget what our primary mission is. And putting the system together, making it a functional relationship for all aspects and all components in that ecology. Again, many thanks.
Comment about glyphosate, I think being what you called a 100-year chemical. Could you elaborate on that just a little bit?
It's a very unique chemistry. Jim Chang, who lives in San Francisco here, is the inventor. Again, for Stauffer Chemical Company, is a boiler cleaner and pipe cleaner and that. But it has such a broad activity. As an antibiotic, as a chelator, as an herbicide, and a number of other purposes. There peels off paint fairly nicely too in some areas, but that it's estimated it will probably be 100 years before a comparable compound is invented, is thought of. So.
I don't understand how glyphosate works with GMO foods.
Okay. With GMO foods, I showed that list of pathogens over here that aren't sensitive to glyphosate.
Right.
those organisms, there are those soil organisms that have an alternative EPSPS system. So that they took the genetics, the gene series from Agrobacterium tumefaciens, a plant cancer producer, took that group of genetic material, nucleic acid, and inserted it then back into the plasmid, the T1 Ti plasmid, but they insert that into the plant then. You can also shoot it in, and what that does is it shoots it in, it disrupts the integrity of the genetic code, but then it, in 1 in a million or 1 in 2 million cells that is introduced into, will survive the treatment and produce that alternative EPSPS so that it keeps the plant then functional, but it doesn't, it's not as efficient, and that's why you see all of the other reduced efficiency in the GMO. We've never had a GMO plant that produces, that yields comparable to its parent. It's always a yield reduction.
Are you putting glyphosate into the plant?
No, we put the, there's nothing in the GMO plant that does anything to the glyphosate. The only thing it does is make it so the plant can tolerate the glyphosate because it has an alternative pathway. Now, if you listen to the press release Tuesday out of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they reported on 4 papers and that in studying what's happening with genetically engineered plants, because they always produce a toxic entity called formaldehyde. In a normal plant, formaldehyde is produced through amino acid metabolism, serine to glycine, and a number of other, several other pathways, or 3 C1 metabolism pathways that can eliminate the formaldehyde from the plant so we don't have a residue. In a GMO plant, you have a detectable residue. That's probably why rats and squirrels and deer can tell the difference between a GMO and a non-GMO. If you break the ear in two on a GMO corn plant and smell it, you'll smell the formaldehyde. So that with that level of formaldehyde in the FEMA trailers for Katrina, the highest level of formaldehyde in all those trailers that they moved people out of because of asthma and allergy reaction was 0.097 parts per million. That was the highest. What we're finding now in the GMO corn, some of the other GMO plants, because of the blockage of C1 metabolism, we're finding from 10 to 200 parts per million. If you're going to eat GMO for a long time, when you go to the undertaker, ask for a discount, because you'll already be half pickled. But a very serious concern.
If you spray Roundup around a watershed in, say, the summer, would you expect the impact on the watershed to be more when it starts to rain in the runoff, or is it consistently going to follow after that over a period of time?
It's going to be, any runoff is going to carry glyphosate, because even though you have it throughout the soil in that root area, you also have a bunch of it that goes onto the soil surface. That's going to be complexed with your calcium and magnesium. It's much more damaging to consume that water with the chelated magnesium and other minerals, because the body, you'll absorb it, you take it into the body, but the kidney can't eliminate it. That's why we have end-stage kidney failure. I work in Guatemala as a consultant on sugarcane, coffee, and bananas. We've eliminated glyphosate essentially 100% from sugarcane in Guatemala. And El Salvador has just banned it. Its use was as a ripening agent. It went out 4 to 6 weeks before harvest, and then they burn the leaves off the plant. You say, okay, you have 25% of the male workers, sugarcane workers in El Salvador that are dying from end-stage kidney failure right now. 20,000 have died in Nicaragua and Panama from end-stage kidney failure from glyphosate. And you say, well, how did they get it when it was applied 6 weeks earlier? Isn't it poof and it's gone? No, it's poof and it's chelated, very strong chelated. And what we find is that as the sugarcane workers then go out in that charred sugarcane field with a machete, that they will cut off a little chunk of the stalk and chew on it for the sugar. It's energy, it's a habit. And in doing that then, they get that glyphosate, which is concentrated in the storage tissues of the plant. They get the glyphosate. They also have the ash then that's high in the minerals. And we think that it's that combination why we're having such a tremendous impact then from end-stage kidney failure and lethality.
Thank you.
About 20 years ago, a friend of mine and myself held a conference at the Claremont Hotel, and we invited the managers of the fire districts. And so we had about 35 managers. And we cut branches of oak trees that had glyphosate applied just around the base. And then we cut branches of oak trees that hadn't been anywhere near glyphosate, and then torched these. And the glyphosate branches melted immediately upon the torch. The other branches, it was very difficult to light. And so they're actually increasing fire hazard by using this.
Yeah, when you treat it with glyphosate, you shunt all of that energy over and you increase your oil content, especially in eucalyptus. But what they don't realize is that bottom 18 inches on the trunk of a tree is as absorptive for glyphosate as the leaf is. Same thing on a cotton stem. You can get as much glyphosate in the plant through the stem as you can on the leaf. Bruce Wood in Georgia, Dr. Wood, actually applies his micronutrients around the base of the tree to take care of his nickel deficiency up in the top, because if you go on up, it's not quite as absorptive, but that bottom 18 to 24 inches, even though it looks like it's all bark and all, well, in eucalyptus, you have a lot of that bark that peels off anyway, but it looks like on a regular tree that's just all dead tissue. Extremely absorptive. And glyphosate moves it in both directions in the plant. It's a very mobile systemic chemical.
I particularly like this, but I hope everybody in this room talks to their supervisor, because the supervisors are allowing, like last year, 35% of the area used glyphosate under emergency conditions. They used it in Paradise Park, and anyway, this year they also passed the same thing, and they think they're going in the right direction because they reduced the uses 78%. But they should immediately stop, and I'm so impressed with what you said. And I hope everybody here writes and speaks to their supervisor and asks them to reconsider what they are recommending to the open space district, and immediately stop spraying in the median strips and in the parks. And they said at their meeting, if we only had the private people stopping using this in their own homes, this would be great. And on the label, it says poison ivy reducing, also good for poison sumac and poison oak, and recommended highly for use in recreational areas.
You know, the DOE at the Berkeley lab uses goats. I mean, they're pretty powerful.
There are a number of different alternatives, and they'll be adaptable to different areas in the area, and it's a matter of that management aspect. Needs to be some additional research done, but we've had a silver bullet, so all of that research talked about 1950. Let me go back here.
As more focused on a solution, so what's the half-life of glyphosate? And what is, how does it degrade, or how can you counter it, I guess?
How do you counter it in the body?
Both environmentally and the body.
In the body, in Europe, they market a product called actobalmin. It's a humic acid, and about 400 milligram per day. If you're gonna take humic acid or clinoptilolite, a special form of zeolite, both of those will pull glyphosate from the body. But they're, again, like glyphosate, they're not selective. So if you're gonna take them, make sure you're taking a good broad spectrum mineral supplement. We had one small town that hadn't had a live birth for 16 months, 2.5 years ago. Miscarriage, when we talked to one of the veterinarians that I work with, that's identified an entity that's associated with reproductive failure. Went over to the medical school and he asked for some tissue for miscarried fetuses, umbilical tissue or placental tissue, to see if that's also in the human situation. We found in all of these young women that very high concentration in the saliva and in the blood. They went on that material, it's a humic clinoptilolite type material, and to my knowledge, all of them that wanted to have a family have had a successful pregnancy. The doctor's comment at the medical school was, why, we don't even worry about it anymore. It's not unusual for a woman to have 4 or 5 miscarriages before she can have a normal birth. That's not normal. I can guarantee you it's not normal. We'd never survived this long if that had been the case. But it does pull the glyphosate out, and it appears to pull this entity that's associated with reproductive failure.
That example you gave up at Yakima Valley in Washington, what was the invasive weed? Was that Spartina?
What's what?
What were they spraying for? Was it Spartina, do you know?
I don't know what the invasive words were in the Three Rivers.
Can you answer the second part of that though? Like how do you neutralize it in the environment? Is there a way, like, if you want to go from, let's say, a GMO cropland and you want to then start growing organically, right? So how would you neutralize what's already in the environment?
Well, legally, you have to have 3 years to get it certified.
So I'm talking about what
Now,
really take.
that doesn't mean that your glyphosate's out. One of my recommendations is that you use some lime or some gypsum, and you keep it tied up so it's not taken up by the plant. We do have 4 or 5 groups now of biologists, microbiologists that are developing biological cocktails that look really promising for degrading it in the soil.
So there's some promise.
There's a lot of work going on and a lot of promise.
So I'd like to just thank Dr. Huber for coming, and if you have more questions,